Okay, so I've got the recording going now. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well. So we've got a great day today. We're covering information security. It's chapter 4 in the textbook. A lot of great material in this chapter. We're going to get through as much as we can today. What we don't finish up today, though, it's not going to be the end of the world. Next class, we'll certainly finish up anything. Shouldn't be more than 30 minutes in next class. Probably another 30 minutes or so for the discussion and debate. And that's going to cover a lot of the topics that we'll discuss today. This will be more of, for tomorrow, probably be a lot more about opinions. You know, what do you think about this? You know, what should the government do? What should they not do? Just a reminder, I'm never here to really tell you what the government should do or what they shouldn't do or anything like that. But it'll be a good time to kind of discuss and maybe have a little debate about some of the different possibilities there. But for today, we're going to focus on information security, kind of talk about what it is, what it typically comprises within an organization. Also talk about some common threats that information systems face. It's not just going to be, viruses. It's going to be a lot of different types of threats. Talk about how we can actually protect against those threats, because simply saying that, your system is going to be in a lot of trouble if you don't do this, that, and the other thing, you have to explain what steps we can take. And we're going to cover this from a managerial perspective, of course. But just kind of say, what can we do? And then also some controls to kind of make sure that we're having, appropriate measures taken place on our systems. Any questions before we begin? Certainly always feel free to jump in with any questions. But, first we'll talk about the most basic level. One of the primary goals of information security is really a kind of three-pronged goal. And it's the CIA Triad here. And that's a fancy way of saying, we want to ensure that any system we have in place meets these three things. And that's going to be confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, it's not to be confused with anything with the Central Intelligence Agency. It just happens to share the acronym. So at the very top there, we have confidentiality. And that is saying that the information will not be accessed by inappropriate parties. So if I have a system and the information can be freely accessed by anyone, that's going to be a problem. So we want to avoid that in any sort of information system. And we'll talk about how as we go throughout this chapter. Now, next we have integrity. That's simply saying that we have accurate information within the information system. So imagine if we're a bank and we have a system without integrity. That means that every single balance we have recorded could be wrong. That's a huge problem from a banking standpoint. I think that I don't need to spend too much time explaining why, but certainly, if people don't know how much money they have, that could certainly cause a lot of problems, and certainly from the bank's perspective as well. Then lastly, availability. That's basically saying, can people access the system? It's not to be confused with can the correct people access the system. This is saying, is the system in and of itself available to be accessed by anyone? So that differs a little bit from confidentiality, in that confidentiality would say, is it only accessible to the correct people? So it's a little confusing maybe. Any questions about that before we go on? So just kind of recap everything. These are what we want to have for any system. We want it to have confidentiality. We want it to have integrity within the information. And we want the information to be available. Any one of these aspects could be affected. And if it is, that's a failure. If the availability, if we can't access our system, we're losing money. If other people who aren't supposed to access our system, we could also lose money. And lastly, if the integrity, if the information within our system is inaccurate, it's basically useless and could even be harmful to us. So we generally want to avoid those sorts of problems within any sort of system. So let's now talk about, what information security is. And at the basic level, we want to distinguish between these three things. They're very similar. They're very related. But it's important that we understand the difference between threats, exposure, and vulnerability. So when we think about a threat is something that hasn't materialized. It's a danger that we could face, but it hasn't yet materialized into something. And exposure is going to be the damage that results if the threat is compromised. Or if it compromises the resource. So in other words, if the threat comes true, what is our exposure? What is going to happen to us? And then lastly, vulnerability is actually going to be the possibility that the system will be harmed by a threat. So, we talk about what the threat itself is. That's going to be the danger of the exposure. And then we talk about the exposure. which is going to be the damage that could result. How exposed are we to it? And then the vulnerability is actually the possibility. So those are very interrelated, but there's some slight differences there. Be a great thing to take some notes on and probably use on a test in case you see a test question asking about that. In an open book environment, you can do that. If this were not an open book test, you couldn't, but luckily for you, all it is. So that's an important thing. But when we talk about the vulnerability, the possibility, the likelihood, there's a lot of different things that kind of drive this for firms to have. And, one of the main things is having the system exposed to some sort of network environment. Oftentimes, it's going to be a wireless network environment, but it could be a wired network environment as well. That's going to greatly enhance the exposure. In other words, if I have a piece of paper sitting on my apartment, and you want to, let's say it's a paper ledger, and you want to edit it, or better yet, let's use a different example. Imagine I had a paper grade book sitting inside my office. What would the exposure be? How could you change your grades if I have a paper grade book? Someone jump in here and tell us how.
It'd be easy for anyone to come in and they could see that paper grade book on there and change their grade.
Exactly. And, to do that, you'd have to enter the office. So, I keep my office door locked usually. So you'd have to break down the door or steal a key. Now, imagine if instead I use a virtual grade book and, instead of having it as a piece of paper where you have to enter the room, now you could be sitting at home. And if you're smart enough, you could probably find a way to hack it. So, that's going to enhance the vulnerability of whatever system I'm using there. Then another thing that could is cheap data storage. Now, this one sounds kind of silly to think about, but, the cheaper that the data storage is, the more likely that someone would be to actually be able to steal it. And, so imagine if I had 1 terabyte worth of data, and it's very valuable data. It's data that maybe could be customer data. Maybe it's data from R&D, whatever the case is. This data is stuff that's important. Well, if 1 terabyte of storage cost $10,000, that's going to make that data less accessible to you than if it cost $50. So it's not necessarily the biggest factor behind vulnerability, but certainly if you don't have the space available to you to copy the data, you can't really get the data. So that's another thing. Then we have factors like, making hacking easier. In general, doing low-level hacking is not very difficult. You can watch a couple YouTube videos, get a pretty good grasp on what to do. We're not going to cover too much of that in here, but you certainly could. But, if you do that, that's typically going to be lower-level attacks. You're going to do things like just run a denial-of-service attack. You're going to run pre-made tools. It's pretty easy to detect when someone's doing that. So it's not necessarily the biggest vulnerability factor, but it does increase the vulnerability of a system. Then we also have things like organized crime groups. Pretty common, especially in the earlier 2000s, where you'd have organized hacking groups that would go and hack websites, hack systems, other stuff like that. Nation-state attacks, I think that's pretty self-explanatory there. I mean, certainly, within the global scape, there are countries that dislike other countries, and one way they could attack each other is with, certainly using some sort of cyber attacks. Again, we're not going to cover that too much in here. But then lastly, we have the vulnerability factor of lack of management support. So if your management doesn't view information security as important, it could be that they don't allocate many resources to preventing information security threats from materializing. And if that's the case, that could certainly be a vulnerability factor. Any questions so far? All right. So, in terms of threats, there are threats that are going to be outside of our organization altogether. These are going to be threats that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but they're not really a member of our organization. And that contrasts with internal threats. An internal threat is simply a threat of someone who is inside our organization, or some factor that is in our organization. And then lastly, we have the idea of hybrid threats. It means that there's some elements of the threat that are outside our organization, some elements that are within our organization. Before we get into that too much, though, let's go ahead and talk about internet threats a little bit. So, there's really going to be a couple of key sorts of internet threats. Of course, the biggest one is going to be malware. There's lots of different types of malware. We'll get into those differences in a couple slides. But for now, just make sure that you kind of are aware of what malware is and that it's a very big threat. It's going to be propagated in most cases via the internet. Not exclusively, though. I mean, there certainly are cases of malware being spread via like a flash drive left inside the parking lot, for example. That's pretty common, actually. People get a flash drive, they want to see what's on it, and they plug it into their computer, and then could certainly take it over. Pretty rare, though. So we also have the idea of having denial of service attacks. And I think we cover those more in a little bit. But basically, the whole concept is that you have an organized attack on your website or other system where you have so many different requests to view the website that the server can't handle them all. So basically, that means that no one can actually access the system. And then lastly, we have unauthorized access. And that's simply any person who's not a member of your system, or organization rather, trying to access your system. And that could be a very bad thing, as you can imagine. So, basically we want to protect against these. So, we talk about some of the external threats. These are examples of external threats, floods, disasters, natural disasters rather, storms, earthquakes, tornadoes. Any of these could roll through at any time, really. Maybe you wouldn't see an earthquake or whatever. I mean, maybe you wouldn't see a tornado in the middle of not tornado season, but in most cases, they don't necessarily have a ton of warning. And these are things that we could certainly see take place, and they can really greatly impact the availability of our resources. We think back to the CIA Triad. If there's a flood, can you go to the office? Maybe not. Let's say that we lose power as a result of the flood. Can you access a system without it having power? Probably not. So it probably wouldn't affect the integrity, probably wouldn't affect the confidentiality, but this would certainly impact the availability. And from that perspective, these can be very bad. So we could also have a lot of man-made disasters. I have fire here. Fire could certainly start as a result of action from a person. Someone could light a match, and they could set a building on fire. It certainly happens. Of course, fires can also start via non-human action. So there's a lot of different ways to approach fire. I'll kind of let you decide which is more likely, I guess. But you can also have power outages as a result of stuff happening. Cut cables. It's very common for things like internet cables. Someone's digging a hole and they accidentally knock out a whole town's worth of internet. That could be a bad problem. So each of these are examples of man-made disasters, and just like the natural disasters, these are pretty likely to affect the availability of whatever system you're interacting with. But let's go ahead and talk about some ones that may affect other aspects of the system as well. So these are going to be more internal threats. We have employees. They work for us. They're, by definition, a member of our organization. They could certainly steal an asset. You can walk home with a laptop, never bring it back to the office. That's a severe problem. Anything that's on that laptop could then be compromised. Certainly, they could copy information. They have the customer database. It's a very common practice, but still widely considered unethical to copy basically the entire client list if you're in a sales position before you leave a sales job. So that could certainly be unauthorized copying. Then unauthorized access in general. This is something where you have an employee who is in fact in your organization, but maybe they're not assigned to a certain department or division, and they get information from that department or division without authorization to do so. We also have the idea of bypassing security measures. This is common with things like, imagine you had a policy where every 5 minutes of inactivity, a system was locked. Well, maybe what they do is they say, okay, let's say they're a doctor in a hospital. Maybe they say, to the nurse, hey, can you wiggle the mouse every 4 minutes so the system doesn't lock me out? That's bypassing security measures. That could be a bad thing. And then we also have things like data entry errors. You're putting in information, and if you enter the incorrect information, let me ask you guys this: which one of the CIA Triad aspects do you think is going to impact if you enter incorrect information? Is that going to be confidentiality, availability, or integrity?
Integrity.
Okay, that's exactly correct. And
I was going to go with integrity too.
Yeah, let me make sure I got both of you down. Let's see. Jordan, you said integrity, didn't you?
No, that wasn't me. I was trying to hear the question again.
Oh, I gotcha. Who did say integrity first?
I said Brandon said integrity second.
Yeah.
Travis.
Who said it first though? I didn't catch the name.
Me, Travis.
Travis. I don't see you in the meeting. I mean, I know you're in the meeting. I'm just saying it's not showing up. It's on the right side of my screen anyway. I'll make sure to give both of you guys extra credit for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, sorry about that. So anyway, that certainly is something that could lead to some issues with integrity. But there's, even more problems that we could run into. Things like using a weak password. You look at the list of the top 10 most used passwords. If you use one of those passwords, it's very easy to guess what your password is. There's probably like 10 passwords that are used in 30% of accounts. So it wouldn't be hard to guess that. You could do that manually. But even using any sort of dictionary word, you could easily, depending on how the system's configured, you could easily run a dictionary attack and get into an account within an hour or two. Wouldn't be too difficult. And then, just in general, not using best practices, not understanding what they are. Maybe that could be one part of this, but then maybe ignoring them, whatever the case may be, just not having a knowledge of what to do. And we have examples like social engineering, where someone kind of, coerces someone to give the password using, somewhat effective technique. Maybe you pose as someone else and you fake some sort of emergency and you say, I really need to get into this account. This is happening right now, blah, blah, blah. And you really kind of try to pressure the person to let you access it. So, just in general, those are some common types of employee threats that we may see kind of transpire within an information system. So I've got a kind of humorous video right here from Office Space. This is the one where they take the virus that they wrote and they actually install it onto their system that they're using. And I can't really play it here. And even if I played it in class, I'd still mute it. It uses some pretty colorful language that I don't really want to play to the entire lecture hall for obvious reasons. But it's a really interesting scene. They take the floppy drive and they install it, and then that's basically the whole scene. I mean, they kind of make a whole big production out of it. But that's another example of an employee threat. The employees knowingly wrote a virus application to allow them to obtain some additional money depending on the transactions that were going through the system. So it's an interesting clip, certainly a humorous one. Can't condone the language on it though, so just know that. Let's talk about some of the system software. So, you have all these different sorts of systems. You have desktop computers everywhere. Maybe you have laptops, mobile devices, certainly cell phones. Those could be owned by the organization. And, from an organizational standpoint, if we have 10,000 different systems, 10,000 different pieces of hardware, rather, then we need to keep track of 10,000 different pieces of hardware. We need to do things like ensure that we have up-to-date software on them. Maybe we have cell phones, and maybe some of the cell phones are no longer supported by the manufacturer. Well, at that point, if we're having company data stored on it, it's probably a good idea to look towards phasing those out. So, you'd have them upgrade their devices to newer devices that could obtain the latest security updates and, make sure they can run the latest software. So if we fail to do that, we could certainly run into cases where, there's going to be some sort of threat actually transpire into a breach. And as that happens, we lose money, we lose data, maybe we lose a competitive advantage. Someone steals KFC's recipe for the 12 spices, then what is KFC's advantage going to be? Of course, having said that, I think they do have to release what the spices are for, allergy reasons. But, in terms of knowing the exact quantities, that could be something that, KFC really relies upon is a secrecy. Same thing with Coca-Cola. They make a big production about, the storing their recipe inside their vault and all that. But, yeah, so, this kind of leads into an interesting discussion on to what level do you allow employees to install applications? There's several different ways to approach this. One way you could approach it as an organization is say, well, we're going to establish policy that we have this whitelist, and anything that's on the whitelist can be freely installed, any sort of application. But if an application is not on the whitelist, it cannot be installed. And that can greatly enhance the security while at the same time, it could certainly lead to some dissatisfaction among employees. Imagine you're at an office environment and you can't install Spotify on your computer. That could bum you out. That certainly is something that is pretty common. Or maybe you're on a company-owned cell phone and you can't, you can't access certain applications you would normally use. That could also bum you out. Of course, in contrast, we could establish a blacklist, and any applications on the blacklist cannot be used. But then any other application would be able to be installed. So those are two kind of different approaches, kind of like the opt-in versus opt-out approaches, where it just depends upon to what degree applications are automatically allowed or disallowed. But then kind of beyond that, we have different endpoints, as they're going to be called. We have different laptops, desktops, phones, and all that. It may make a lot of sense to install, some sort of a corporate-focused antivirus application on those devices that report back centrally. So that way we know immediately if a device has been infected with something. So that's going to be something we could certainly take advantage of as well. These are going to be pretty common inside of businesses to use stuff like that. But beyond software, we also have hardware threats where the hardware itself could become compromised. And this is typically going to happen whenever we have hardware within a non-secure environment. So it's not behind a lock and key, it's out in the open. Maybe we have a computer in the lobby that the office administrator or whatever uses. That could certainly be something where you could easily walk up to and install something on it. That could be a problem. Then beyond that, beyond just installing physical devices or anything like that, you could steal the device. That would certainly be unethical and illegal, but it could happen, and it often does happen. So, to kind of deter some of that, we can of course use things like locking our devices down. A lot of devices have some sort of Kensington lock on them, where we can install a device to make it to where you can't just walk away with the device. Having said that, if you got a good pair of bolt clippers, you could probably take care of that. But also having things like alarms, lots of different physical devices to kind of deter that theft. We're not going to necessarily eliminate it, but if we make it less likely, that's going to be a good thing. Of course, we also want to balance the cost of doing so, and we'll get to that in the end of the chapter, basically. But then beyond that, of course, we could also use physical spying devices. We're not just limited to stealing the device. We could, for example, install a keylogging device on a device. And, then for anything that's entered on the computer or whatever device we install it into is going to be, stored on maybe the device itself, and then they come back later to retrieve it. Or maybe they send it to, somewhere, some website or something. Whatever the case may be, that's certainly something that's happened many times. So it could also be some unauthorized cameras. This is particularly seen whenever you're inputting things like a PIN, anything like that, where people would want to see what the PIN is. They stick up an unauthorized camera. Of course, that's not the only use of unauthorized cameras. We're not going to cover some of the even less appropriate uses of them, but certainly. So, we could certainly avoid a lot of that, for things like, if keylogger can get a password. So how can we avoid, someone getting a password that way? Well, certainly, keeping the hardware secured is one way, but another way would be to use things like multiple factors to authenticate. And we'll cover that in a little bit here. But basically, if you have the password, but you still can't access the system, that's a good thing. So, and we also kind of talk about some examples of threats that are going to be very deliberate. So, we have this idea of having, some sort of corporate espionage. Happens quite a bit, actually, where, maybe one corporation isn't doing so well, and they want to see what are our competitors doing. So maybe they send someone over. Maybe they're from a hostile nation to the United States, and they want to send over some sort of spy. That's lots of different types of espionage, where that's pretty much what happens. And it can be hard to kind of avoid that. How do you actually avoid that? I'm not really sure. Certainly, you'd want to do thorough background checks on your employees. But beyond that, it's very difficult. Extortion of information, certainly that could be quite a criminal act. You're talking about, felonious extortion. That's something but it does happen. So, if you have a compromising situation, that could be something that's not good. We also have like sabotage, vandalism. This could be physical or non-physical. You could deface a website just as easy as you could deface a building. They're both, of course, criminal, but it could happen. It's something that, we want to protect against. For protecting a building, maybe we establish a physical barrier. Maybe we have, high definition cameras that can identify license plates. They can identify faces very well, things like that. We have theft of equipment. We've kind of talked about that some. And then identity theft. How do you avoid identity theft? Well, you really can't. But, probably the best way is just to avoid putting your identity out there so much. I mean, imagine if you published your social security number on your Facebook profile. That'd be a pretty ill-advised thing to do. I don't think anyone would disagree with me saying that. But, having said that, it's probably also a good idea to do things like freeze your credit. Make sure that, no one can easily establish new lines of credit in your name. So we have some more deliberate threats here. Compromising intellectual property. Again, that's basically just saying, people are, whatever. It doesn't have to be people, it could be other companies. We have various intellectual property within our firm, and then someone could, use it without permission. That could be things like making a product that violates intellectual property. It could be many other things as well. So we have software attacks. That's malware. We're going to cover that in a couple slides here. Alien software. This could be like examples of bloatware. It's particularly common if you buy a new computer. A lot of times it just has a lot of software on there that's not really wanted. That could be one vector of attack. Maybe the software isn't updated, and the vulnerability is discovered later on, and then you use the software, and then you're compromised. So that could be a bad thing. Then we also have supervisory control and data acquisition attacks. These are going to be particularly common inside of critical infrastructural systems, like, for example, water treatment plants, manufacturing facilities, where they have these very massive systems in place that are pretty simple. But if they're compromised, then, maybe there's no production. That could be a bad thing. And maybe there's no safe water. Think about electricity generation. If we couldn't have electricity, that'd be a very bad thing. And of course, we also could have cyber terrorism or cyber warfare, both of which would be very bad. Those are not good things there. Let's talk about malware in a little bit more detail. So, at the very top here, I have probably the most common piece of malware. It's going to be the virus. And a virus is something that spreads, but it only spreads via, some sort of interaction. So you have to click on it, you have to let it run. Then once it runs, you could be infected. But if you don't let it run, it's not going to be able to run without some sort of interaction there. Contrast with a worm. A worm can self-replicate, and it basically is going to exploit some sort of vulnerability within maybe an operating system, within a piece of software, whatever the case may be. And it'll basically self-propagate. It's very common among like network devices, for example. One device on the network gets a worm, then the worm basically spreads to all the other devices. And that can be pretty devastating for an organization to deal with. We can also have a Trojan horse. That's going to be whenever a malicious application kind of masquerades itself as a legitimate application. So if you're downloading an application from the internet, it may look legitimate, but it may not be. Backdoor is not really malware. I'm not really sure why I have it on this slide, but I'll talk about it anyway. So a backdoor would be a vulnerability within an application. Or it could also be, like a password, like a universal password to access some device, where basically third parties can access a device. It's more like an exploit, though. It's not really malware in and of itself. These could be common on like a security camera. If you buy a cheap security camera, could possibly have some sort of backdoor account on there to where some third party, maybe some company overseas, in certain countries over there, could access your camera and see what's present. A great example of this could be something like the Hikvision or Dahoo cameras that are being banned. And I want to say every single firm that does any sort of contracting business with a lot of the federal government, certainly Department of Defense. I'm not sure about how far that actually expands, but that's certainly something we're seeing right now. There's a lot of people who are believing those cameras to be, compromised by a nation. So that's a good example of that. A logic bomb is simply a part of an application that, upon meeting some criteria, will basically do its attack. So, for example, you could install an application and it could run perfectly fine for maybe, a year. And then, by the end of the year, maybe it's going to do something like encrypt your entire hard drive. Maybe it's going to, destroy your boot sector, whatever it does. It certainly does it upon the not creation, but upon the satisfaction of a criteria that is set. So, sometimes it's a time-based thing. It's going to be on your system for so long. Sometimes just a certain day, maybe like April Fool's Day or whatever, happens a lot with some of these. There's no real, this is the answer for everything, but it's just some criteria that's preset. As soon as that gets met, then it'll do whatever it sets out to do. Ransomware is going to be a piece of software that's going to basically encrypt your hard drive contents and demand a ransom to decrypt them. We'll show some examples of this in the next part of class, but the whole concept behind this is that, once you're infected, basically everything you have on your system is no longer accessible. And, this could be an interesting discussion, if you're a business who has this happen to you, should you pay the ransom? If it's the only way you can get your data back, should you pay the ransom? I want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Because on the one hand, if you pay,
I would.
I mean, I think if the information is that valuable to you, I mean, I guess you have to do what you have to do.
yes, that's certainly one approach. Does anyone feel differently? Anyone think you shouldn't pay the ransom?
No, I agree with him. I think you should.
Okay. Well, I mean, certainly a lot of people would feel that way, and other people would feel that if you pay the ransom, you're incentivizing this action. You're basically making it to where it's beneficial for these third parties, or clearly let's call them what they are, for these criminals to engage in this. It's like, do you negotiate with terrorists as a nation? Some nations do, but a lot of them don't. So there's no right or wrong answer there, but certainly there's something to be said, at least, for just saying we're not going to pay your ransom. And that's something that some firms do, but a lot of firms go ahead and pay it. Then spyware, as the name would suggest, is basically malware that is designed to spy in some way on the users. Could be things like looking at their browsing history. Scarier enough, it could be things like viewing webcams. That's certainly something that we've seen. That's not a good thing for pretty obvious reasons there. I mean, I don't think I need to explain why on that one. But these aren't the only attacks. When we talk about software attacks, malware, that's just some examples of attacks. Other attacks could be things like a phishing attack, where basically mass amounts of email are going to be sent out to a lot of different people to kind of masquerade as some sort of a legitimate third party. And they want to maybe obtain a password, maybe they want to obtain some information, whatever the case may be. It's untargeted. That's going to contrast with spear phishing. So spear phishing is going to be heavily targeted towards maybe an individual or maybe just a group of individuals. So you can imagine, let's say that a bank is compromised. And rather than just sending out a generic phishing attack from like Bank of America or something like that, they have your specific bank. They have your specific account number. They have everything about you. And they say, click our link. That's spear phishing. If they have more specific tailored information to who they're actually trying to target. Now, a more specific form of spear phishing is going to be whaling. And in whaling, you're going to try to not only target someone, but you're going to try to target someone of high stature. A lot of times this could be targeted toward like a top level executive of a company, could be targeted toward a top level government official. Just basically you're trying to target the top dog, basically. That's what you're trying to do with whaling. Whereas spear phishing, yes, you're targeting someone, but you're not necessarily targeting them because they're, the CEO of a company. You're just targeting them because they're more likely to. Then, of course, eavesdropping is going to be listening in on a conversation in which you're not a party. So, we talk about eavesdropping. A lot of times we could think of this as being physical, but it doesn't have to be physical. Imagine if you had a virus on your device that was listening to whatever's coming through the microphone. If it's listening right now, hopefully it's learning some good information. But, maybe, it already knows everything. Either way, that's what the whole idea behind eavesdropping is. Just listening to conversations that it's not a party of. And of course, that is illegal in most states. And then we also have shoulder surfing. So, with shoulder surfing, of course, it's where you're looking at information that, you're not supposed to be looking at. So I like to use the example in class. A lot of people have their laptops out in class. It's pretty likely that someone's sitting behind them and they might, accidentally look over the screen, but sometimes they might be purposely looking at the screen. They could see a lot of interesting stuff, I'm sure, sometimes, but they could also see interesting stuff by looking at the front of the room and watching the lecture. I like to say that. Maybe that's not 100% true, but I think it's pretty true. Anyway, so we also have the idea of having physical controls. So, with these attacks, these are attacks that aren't necessarily, purely technological. At some degree, they rely upon, a human. And, with physical controls, we can a lot of times mitigate a lot of these threats, using locks, not just having locks, but actually using them. If you have a lock and you don't use the lock, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. You might as well not have it. But, if you have it and use it effectively, that's a good deterrent. A lot of times people may be hesitant to break into a place if it's locked, whereas if it's unlocked, they're not going to really attract unwanted attention by simply turning a doorknob and going in a room. Then having things like gates, fences, walls, anything like that where you surround a property that you don't want to have, physical access to, that can certainly deter a lot of people from accessing that property. I'm not saying it's going to be 100%, of course, but certainly it'll be a great deterrent. And, also, so you see someone climbing a fence, they're probably not supposed to be there. If they were supposed to be there, they'd likely take the gate, so. I could certainly make things like that, a lot better. Having human security guards or some sort of security guards, don't have to be human, I suppose. Could certainly kind of reduce the likelihood of someone just entering a place they're not supposed to. Also, things like using ID cards, certainly for things like entry to a building. That could be a great thing. Let's say you lose a physical key, and let's say you're a company with 100,000 employees inside the headquarters. If you lose a key, do you think that they're going to change all the locks out if it's physical key? Probably not. But if they lose your ID card, you can easily deactivate that and get a new one. So, certainly using these sorts of physical controls can be very beneficial from the firm's standpoint. Then also using access controls for accounts. So there's really three main kind of components of access control. It's going to be the identification, there's going to be the authorization, and then there's going to be authentication. So at the first level, we have the identification. And that's basically just saying, who is this person? So it's going to be their username, or it could be their name, it could be their face, whatever the case may be. It's the identification. Then, at the next phase of access controls, we have the authentication. We say, how do we prove that this is actually the person? How do we prove the identity of whoever's trying to access the system? This is where we use things like a password. We use things like a physical access token. We use things like a card key. We use things like maybe multiple factor authentication. Some sort of kind of a temporary password like that. It could also be biometrics. If you're using facial recognition to enter a building, it'd be kind of dangerous, but you could do that. You could also use things like fingerprint identification, handprint identification, lots of different options there. And then, once you've authenticated the person, you made sure, yes, this is actually the correct person, you give them access. So, that's where we actually would grant them access to the resources. Okay, but let's kind of talk more about some different types of, kind of controls for this. So we've had, some discussion on, the different threats. We've had some discussion on the different policies. Let's talk about the controls. How do we actually implement this stuff? Is it practical for us to really engage in a lot of this? I think it is. So at the most basic level, we have a network, and we want to keep bad actors out of our network. Well, one of the most simple ways to do that is with a firewall. And, with a firewall, we can easily ban, anyone, really. We can do this automatically. We can have policies in place where, depending upon behavioral analysis of what they're doing, we can automatically ban people from, accessing our website in any way. And that can be very beneficial for us. It doesn't have to just be for a website. It could be for any system, of course. And, it's basically what a firewall does, is it, keeps the bad actors out. Then we also have things like a demilitarized zone. That's going to be if we have maybe some things we want to have public facing, and then other things we want to have internal only. So basically anything we want to have public facing, we want to have access for the greater world to have access to, we put that inside a demilitarized zone. And then anything else we put behind that. So it can't be accessed, you know. So this is very common if we have like a storefront for a website. We would put the websites, you know, the servers that the website is running on, we'd put that inside the demilitarized zone so it could be accessed outside. Anti-malware systems, as we've talked about, you know, having some sort of a corporate kind of style anti-malware system in place where, you know, maybe it scans things like emails for any sorts of malware, it scans things like devices for any sorts of malware. And the key behind this is that we have central notification. So maybe it's the IT department, maybe it's the security department, however our organization is structured, they're getting notifications and they can easily and quickly act whenever there's any sort of potential breach. So that's going to be very beneficial. If we just had, you know, some sort of anti-malware system that didn't centrally notify us, we may not actually know that we were compromised. Then we also use things like encryption. You know, I gave the example before of having your files encrypted. That'd be a bad thing if it were done by ransomware. But if it's not done by ransomware, this can actually be a very great way for us to not lose, or at least not to have our information compromised if a device is physically taken. Because, you know, imagine if you take a device and you can't actually use any of the information on it. You got the device, but you don't have the information. So that's what encryption would basically do for us. It's a pretty big simplification there, of course, but yeah, certainly it's a thing there. And then also virtual private networking. This could be used for a lot of different purposes. A lot of times it can be used for things like working at home and still accessing company resources. You do that with a virtual private network. So from all outside appearances, it would appear as though, you know, you're on the company network, but in reality, you're on a different network. And this basically sets up an encrypted kind of tunnel to where, you know, anyone who's observing the connection from where you are to the office, they can't actually see what you're doing. It's encrypted. Then, of course, employee monitoring. This could be in a lot of shapes or forms. The whole concept is that we're looking at what our employees are doing, and if we see something out of the ordinary, maybe we follow up with it. You know, maybe we see an employee who's, you know, accessing very strange websites. A lot of times they're not actually accessing those websites. The device could be infected. Or maybe they are accessing strange websites and they're giving all our information to, you know, a third party. That'd also be bad. So, you know, those sorts of things are stuff that are commonly used by organizations to, you know, reduce their risk. Then, of course, you know, beyond this, you know, we talk about the natural disasters. And, you know, they can certainly cause a lot of problems for our companies. And, you know, we want to make sure that we minimize the problems that are being caused. So one of the most common ways to do this is with a business continuity plan. And basically what this is a formal document where we basically outline, you know, from step by step, you know, how can we continue the firm's operations, you know? So if we had a natural disaster happen, we can't go into our physical offices, how do we continue working? Well, this document will actually handle that. Maybe, you know, the physical office is just completely destroyed in a fire. Maybe it's destroyed in an earthquake, whatever the case may be. You know, we still want to have access to our data. We still want to be able to work. So, you know, the whole concept behind this is that we're going to establish some different ways to do this. And, you know, we can do this in a lot of ways. Some of the common approaches would be to use things like a hot, warm, or a cold site. So we kind of back up and say what those are. So a hot site is going to be a facility that we have access to that has everything we use inside of it. So imagine like we basically had a spare office. It's already got the computers. It's already got everything installed on the computers. And all we have to do is just say, all right, instead of going to office A, you now go to office B. That's a hot site. That contrasts with a cold site. A cold site is we have an office, but it's completely empty. There's no furniture, there's no technology, there's no software. We can certainly get it going, but currently in its current form, it's not really usable. So we'll say, all right, employees, instead of going to office A, you're going to go to office B, and you're going to set up office B. And then once it's set up, you're going to use it. And of course, there's going to be something in between those two. There's going to be some site called a warm site, where the warm site is not fully ready for use, but it does have technology. It does have furniture inside of it. However, it doesn't necessarily have all the technology updated. It doesn't necessarily have, you know, every single thing that we use today inside of it. So it's some combination between the two. Typically, you'd have computers in there, but maybe the computers aren't actually configured for immediate use. So you'd have to have, some basic configuration done to allow them to basically take over. Went kind of faster. Any questions so far? Certainly, if something's not clear, feel free to interrupt. It's not a problem at all. But then, beyond this, we also want to make sure that we have the integrity of our system, very well. We've talked a lot about, the physical access, or not just physical access, but just, kind of the availability in general. Can we actually access the system? Well, it's also important, and probably equally important, that we have accurate information within our system. So if we have an information system that is doing transactions, for example, and let's say that every transaction we do, we lose 1/10 of a penny on, and we do 1 million transactions in a year, that's a substantial portion of money. So we want to have audits in place to where we can, make sure that we're verifying anything that's taking place within that process. We're looking at the inputs, making sure those are aligning with what they're supposed to. Looking at the outputs, making sure those are aligning with what they're supposed to. And then looking at the processing in the middle and making sure that the processing is not having any sort of malicious activities or anything like that. Doesn't even have to be malicious. It could be inadvertent. If we have inadvertent process difficulties, that could certainly lead to some problems down the line. And of course, there's two main approaches we could do. We could use internal auditing to find these sorts of problems, or we could use external auditing. Of course, it's not a dichotomy where we have to select one or the other. We could certainly do both as well. But generally speaking, you'd probably have some internal auditing, and you'd probably also have some external auditing. So it's pretty much what you do with the information system. You just make sure that everything within it is accurate. It's providing, information that has integrity. Of course, with all of this, this is a really big chapter. There's a lot of information within it. And, I talked earlier on about we want to make sure that what we're doing makes financial sense to do. And that's really the whole concept behind risk management. So we have a risk, and it's kind of like a threat. It's the probability of occurrence. It's how likely is something to occur. That's the risk. And then we want to use risk management to kind of determine what should we do about that risk. We have a risk of a lot of things happening. How do we address each of those risks? And, the whole concept is we're going to identify, what the risks are. We're going to determine how can we control them and then minimize the threats associated with it. So the whole concept behind risk analysis is a really simple concept. It's going to be, the examples in here, of course, are going to be substantially simplified from what you may find in a risk management class, for example. But, in general, you're going to follow some sort of thing like this. You're going to look at the asset, determine how much is this asset worth? What is its value? And then, once you've kind of done that, you also want to say, well, with that, we have this risk. What is the probability of, the value being diminished? And, also with doing that, you say, what is the probability and what is the amount of damage we're likely to incur? And then what you do is you basically compare the cost. So maybe, we're going to keep it nice and simple in this class and just do cost of protecting the asset or the cost of not protecting the asset. But you could certainly have different protective measures and compare the cost in that way as well. So again, this is going to be very simplified from, all the traditional risk management approach, but this kind of shows the basics of how we would actually engage in this analysis. So I've got a quick little example here. We're going to do some more examples as we go. That's basically what the rest of this chapter is. It's just doing risk management analysis. But for this first example here, we have a $1 million asset. And if it's going to be damaged in some way or whatever, we're going to lose 80% of that. And in general, that's going to have a 10% likelihood of occurrence. That means that in general, 10% of years, we're going to lose 80% of the asset. And we can purchase protection for this from 10 years. So basically, we're going to be spending $10,000 per year to protect it. So if we go for 10 years, that's going to be $100,000 of protection. So just based on this right here, we'd simply show that, we're going to take this $1 million asset and we're going to reduce its value by 80%. That means it's now worth $200,000. That's going to happen 10% of years. So all we have to do then is take that loss times the likelihood of occurrence, which is going to be 10%. It's going to be $20,000 a year we're expected to lose, or that's expected to remain, really. So in terms of loss, we're looking at, $80,000 of loss every year. So that's going to be a huge problem right there. So that's just one example. But, with that, we really have some options. So the first thing we could do with risk is we could say, I acknowledge the risk is there, and that's fine with me. That's something I don't mind. And that's going to be risk acceptance, where we take the risk and we say, yes, it's present, but it's fine. And that's a perfectly reasonable approach to take. We don't have to do that, though. We could also do risk transference. And risk transference, we're actually going to say, well, the risk is there, but I can't really afford to lose the $800,000, so I'm going to purchase insurance. And that insurance is actually going to allow me to, kind of spread that loss out over time and also pay a little bit of profit to the insurance company. That's the whole idea of risk transference. Typically, we think of that as going to be some sort of insurance, but it doesn't have to be. It could also be we purchase some sort of bond or something like that, where basically we're taking that loss and we're spreading it out over time. Then risk limitation is where we say the risk is there, and I'm going to do everything I can to minimize the impact of the risk and kind of make sure that we're not going to be adversely affected by it. And then lastly, this is the option that's probably not recommended. It's where we just say, the risk doesn't exist. Even though it does exist, we just ignore it and we say it's not there. And that's kind of this bird right here who's kind of had his head in the sand. That's what we'd be doing there. It's not a wise approach to take. I don't generally state an opinion, but certainly that's something that's not wise to do. So just kind of wrap up. We're not done yet, but just kind of wrap up this slideshow here. We talked about information security. We talked about different threats that we may face within information security. We also talked about some protective measures we could take as a firm. And we also talked about some different controls and policies. And next, we're going to cover some examples of risk management. Any questions so far? Is that pretty clear to everyone? Okay. So you should see now this spreadsheet that I have. I think I'm sharing it at least. Anyway, so basically this spreadsheet just kind of provides some supplemental instructions, some supplemental information about the information security chapter. So on the first worksheet within this spreadsheet, I just have some cases listed off. It just kind of shows, some different kind of things within inside of information security where, basically, we've seen some examples of each of these types of things. We've seen the Equifax breach, the Anthem breach, the healthcare breaches all listed out, ransomware. I've got the Nigerian prince scam on here. I've got a honeypot. We didn't talk about honeypots. Basically, a honeypot would be where you set up something that appears to be attractive. In this case, it was free Wi-Fi. But in reality, you're trying to get information about the people who are using it. It happens to be from a political party that had this done to them. Again, it's just an example that's probably most popular about it. And we had a phishing example on here. And then, we had the largest breach in government history, which was, of course, Office of Personnel Management, which affected a lot of military positions, as well as, many other positions in the military. So, again, there's just kind of some links there to kind of see, in the real world, what happens when these breaches occur. And again, I'm not trying to say, these are good or bad. Of course, breaches are bad, but, beyond that, kind of form your own opinion about, what measures should have been taken place. And the next worksheet here, I have the healthcare breaches that are kind of been published by the Health and Human Services. And this is kind of an interesting thing to see. You look through some of these facilities that have had these breaches occurred. They have how many individuals were infected, or affected, rather, not infected. And it kind of shows, these can be very widespread, and these, of course, are only reported if they have 500 or more individuals affected. So if they had fewer than 500 people, they don't have to report it. And, it kind of talks about the type of breach. That's what I think is really most interesting here, type and location. So, there's some, looks like someone's email was hacked, probably with a phishing attack of some sort, I would guess. That's just a guess, though. Then there's paper that was stolen. I mean, there's all sorts of things you just kind of go through here. And it really shows a good picture of, the breaches that we see. There's really a multitude of systems that can be affected. And it's not so fair to say that, only virus attacks cause damages, because that's not true. Lots of different systems can be affected. Paper can be stolen. Paper can be misplaced. A server can be stolen. It could be misplaced. It could be malicious software installed on a desktop that allows access to the entire database to be downloaded. I mean, there's all these sorts of things that can happen. And that's what this really does a great job of showing. So with that in mind, we have this concept of having a layered approach to security. And in this layered approach of security, what we want to have is we want to make sure that we have each and every layer of our organization is secured. So at the basic level, we have the outermost layer. That's the perimeter. That's going to be our physical access controls. That's going to be things like making sure that we have security in place, making sure we have security cameras, any sort of physical deterrent we can have. That's going to be included in perimeter security. Then we have network security. That's saying that overall on the network, we have things in place like a firewall to make sure that people aren't accessing our site with bad intentions. We also have things like maybe lots of different kind of ways. Basically, just have a robust security on our network. And then we go to each individual endpoint. Again, that's going to be like a desktop device. It's going to be like a laptop, a smartphone, anything that's an end user is going to be using. That's an endpoint. And we have security on each of those devices. Typically we're going to have some sort of enterprise level antivirus application or anti-malware rather, where we're going to have central reporting based on what the device is doing, what it's found on the device, that sort of thing is going to be present. And, with that, we have application security, making sure the applications that we're using are secure. We're not using malicious applications. We have data security. That's going to be things like making sure that the database has appropriate policies to ensure integrity of data, and also making sure that it does things like sanitizing its inputs to disallow for certain attacks that could take place with, maybe someone putting in some malicious commands to have the data do stuff like maybe download it all, maybe delete it all. We just want to avoid any of that. And then at the very center, we have our actual assets we're wanting to protect. So the concept behind this layered approach to security is that if any of these things aren't robust and present, then our mission security assets are going to be exposed, and they're likely going to be compromised. If you had a business where they had the best network security, they had the best endpoint, everything was good, but they didn't use their locks. Anyone can walk in and walk out with their data. That could be very problematic. If you had a case where everything was good except the application security wasn't there, well, then all that has to happen is malicious application gets installed, maybe on purpose, maybe accidentally, and then it's all compromised. Every single bit of it. If you have a password policy that's not good, well, someone could easily figure out the password to one account and they can access the systems in that way. So that's kind of the whole concept behind the layered approach to security. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that? Again, it's certainly, the whole concept is that if any single layer is compromised, everything is compromised. Okay, so enough about that. Let's do some examples of risk management here. So I would like to have some participation if you guys would like to. So I'll do the first one, and then I'll kind of ask some questions for the next couple. But with that in mind, I can't really see the names right now, so you'll have to let me know just so I give you credit for it. If you don't want credit, I guess you don't have to let me know, but I'm guessing you do. Anyway, so we have right here, we have an asset that's valued at $5 million. Pretty valuable asset. And what we're saying is that, this is going to be, if it's going to be compromised in some way, it's going to lose 2.5 million of value. So we have an asset that's worth 5 million. It's going to lose 2.5 million of value. And we want to figure out what's the residual value. What is going to be left over after whatever happened has lost value. So we're just going to start a new Excel formula here. It's going to take this cell where we have the 5 million. We're going to subtract off the cost of occurrence there. Of course, that gives us 2.5 million. And beyond that, we also see that we have a 4% likelihood of occurrence. So in other words, in 4% of years, we're going to see this take place where we basically kind of lose what we had. So, we know the cost up here of this happening is 2.5 million, and we want to annualize that cost. So we know that in 4% of years, this is going to take place, and it's going to have 2.5 million of damage. So all we have to do is just take the likelihood, which is 4%, and multiply that by the cost, which is 2.5 million. And that gives us $100,000. So, with that in mind, we want to then say, well, what is the protection cost, the annual protection cost? We don't have any information about that, so I'm just going to put in, say, 100 or not 100. Let's say $10,000. So now we can either have an annualized cost of occurrence if we do nothing of $100,000, Or we can completely eliminate that in this example, and we can have an annual protection cost of $10,000. So someone jump in here and tell me what we should do. Should we do nothing? Should we accept the risk, or should we mitigate the risk? What do you think?
Get the annual protection.
Okay. And what was your name again?
Travis.
Travis, gotcha. Yeah, like I say, I don't have the things pulled up right now, so I can't really see, who's saying what. So I apologize for that. Exactly, that's exactly correct. Because the annual protection cost is lower than the annual cost of occurrence, we're going to just accept, or not accept. We're going to engage in protection. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Now let's kind of change this up a little bit. So we have the asset value is $5 million again. But now we have a destruction percentage. In other words, if something happens to this asset, we're going to lose 85% of it. So right off the bat, let's just go ahead and do the cost of occurrence here. So we're going to take the $5 million, it's going to multiply it by this 85%, because that's what's going to happen if we lose it. It's going to have a destruction percentage of 85%. And that gives us 4.25 million. So someone else jump in here and tell me, how do I calculate the residual value now? Anyone who hasn't spoken yet want to jump in?
This is Brandon, and I would just basically, you could either say your asset value minus your cost of occurrence.
Yep, you could do that.
And then there's another way, but I guess that's good enough.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the other way would be to take the asset value and subtract, basically take 1 minus 85%, and you could also calculate in that way, which would be basically multiplying it by 0.15. So you just take 0.15 here, and that would give you the same thing. If you want to be really fancy, you could take like 1 minus 0.15, put this in parentheses. I mean, you got lots of different options here. But certainly is. Whoops, that's 1 minus 0.85. Silly me there, but anyway, you see the point. I mean, certainly there's a lot of different ways to calculate this. So let's see. We got a residual value of 750,000. We got a cost of occurrence of 4.25 million. Someone who hasn't spoken yet. Anyone want to jump in and tell me how to calculate the annualized cost of occurrence here? We know the likelihood of occurrence is 5%. How would I calculate this annualized cost? Let me open this up. Anyone who has spoken want to jump in here?
Multiply the residual value by the likelihood of occurrence.
So yeah, you take this residual value right here. But now if you take the residual value, that's going to be what's left over. So we want to get the cost of occurrence. So exactly. Yeah, so we take the cost of occurrence, multiply it by, what do we multiply it by?
5%, the likelihood of occurrence. Exactly.
So if we do that, we'll reach a annualized cost of occurrence right there of $212,000 and $212,500. That's kind of a strange number to say there. So anyway, next we have the protection cost. We see it's $1 million for 10 years. So we want to get the annual protection cost. We know that in general, it's going to cost us $1 million for 10 years. So how do we calculate this annual protection cost, do you think? If something is
$1 million divided by 10.
Yeah, so exactly. We're just making sure that we take that $1 million. It's going to give us, of course, $100,000. Because, if you take a million divided by 10, you basically take a zero off. That's all you have to do. And for now, we're also going to assume that there's going to be no sort of a cost of occurrence after we engage the protection. So if we're comparing $212,500 to $100,000, which should we do? So I want to see, do we accept the risk or do we mitigate the risk?
This is Brittany, and I think you would accept it.
Well, now, why would you say we'd accept it here?
Well, on the other one with the analyzed cost or the annualized cost, since it was greater, we engaged. So this one's greater. So would we not also engage?
So you're saying you would take the protection?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Sorry,
So
I thought that's
mitigate.
what you were asking.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure that everyone's kind of clear there. So yeah, if the annualized cost of occurrence is greater than the annualized cost of protection, then we're going to make sure that we're going to mitigate the risk. If the inverse is true, I think we'll see an example of that in this next one. We might do something a little different. So here, I'm just going to kind of run through this. I think you get how to calculate the cost of occurrence. You just take the asset value, multiply it by the destruction percentage. It's going to give us cost of occurrence 2.5 million. Likelihood of occurrence is going to be 5%. So then all we have to do is take that cost of occurrence, multiply it by likelihood of occurrence, gives us 125,000. I'm going to change this to say $10 million for 10 years. So now we want to get the annual protection cost, annualized protection cost. And of course, we have $10 million for 10 years. It's just going to be $1 million. So now we have a decision. Do we want to spend $1 million a year, or do we want to spend $125,000 per year? In other words, we want to accept the risk at $125,000 expected annual loss, or do we want to mitigate the risk at $1 million?
This is Kyle. Accept it.
Accept the risk.
All right, that's exactly correct. Make sure I get everyone who just answered there. I got you, Kyle. Who else answered?
Rachel.
Gotcha. Just want to make sure that I give everyone credit for participating today. I do like a good participation, so that's a good thing. Then we have one more little example here. So we have an asset that's worth $5 million again. Seems to be the theme of the day, I guess. Destruction percentage of 50%. So the residual value is going to be 1 minus 50%, which of course is also going to be 50%. So it's just going to be just missed a zero there. 2.5 million, and we have another 2.5 million. Likelihood is again going to be 5%. So we just take the likelihood, multiply it by the cost of occurrence, get the annualized cost. We've certainly seen that. But this example adds something a little bit differently here. So there's still going to be some annualized cost of protection, annualized cost of occurrence rather, even after we engage in the protective measures. So in this case, we're going to have, looks like I have $10 million here for 10 years. So that's going to be $1 million plus this annualized cost of protection, which is going to be $1,001,000. That's going to be quite a steep annualized cost of protection. So the total annualized cost of protection here is going to exceed the annualized cost of occurrence at $125,000. So what will we do in this case? Do we want to accept the risk and have the expected loss annually be $125,000, or do we want to mitigate the risk and have the expected total protection cost, including the annualized cost of occurrence, even with the protection, of $1,001,000?
Accept the risk.
Okay, exactly. In this case, we would accept the risk. If I change this, though, to say it's going to be $100,000 per year, change that to $1 million, change this down here to $100,000, we have $101,000 a year. Then we would mitigate the risk. So it's all about what the numbers suggest. That's what we're going to do. Now, of course, there could be a big discussion about the goodwill aspect of it, the danger to reputation, anything like that. Again, that's certainly beyond the scope of this. Are there any questions about this material? Any sorts of questions? Next class, we're going to pick up with some word problems that you're probably likely to see on the exam, and we'll also cover the discussion or debate. So make sure you're here for that. It's going to be a good time. Otherwise, hope you all have a great day. I'll go ahead and end the recording.